It all began on a fog-choked night in mid-October. The kind of night where shadows seemed to stretch endlessly and silence hung thick in the air. My girlfriend Emily and I were driving back from a quiet evening at her parents' house. The road wound through the dense woods, branches looming like skeletal arms. And just as we rounded the last curve before town, we heard it. An agonizing scream, distant yet unnervingly close. At first, we thought it might be an animal in distress. Living in a rural town, these things weren't unheard of. But the sound was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was human, piercing, but with a hollow, unnatural echo. Emily's hand tightened around mine as we exchanged a glance, both unsure if we should keep driving or turn back to investigate. "We should check it out," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, but curiosity gleaming in her eyes. Against my better judgment, I nodded, pulling the car to the side of the road. The fog was thick, and the woods beyond the edge of the road were drenched in darkness, but we stepped out, drawn toward the sound like moths to a flame. As we walked, the screams grew louder, more distinct, as though they were moving toward us. My heart pounded with every step, each one heavier than the last. Emily clutched my arm tightly, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The cold air chilled my skin, and I could feel an unsettling presence around us. We reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering over us like sentinels guarding their secrets. The screams suddenly stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was nothing. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. "We should go back," I muttered. But it was too late. Emily had already stepped forward, into the forest, and I couldn't let her go alone. Reluctantly, I followed, my pulse quickening with every step into the abyss of trees and mist. The forest seemed alive, as though it was watching us, waiting. We wandered deeper into the woods, the air growing colder with each passing minute. The fog curled around our legs, and the faint light from the car faded behind us, leaving only darkness. The screams returned, sharper and closer this time. I grabbed Emily's hand. "We need to leave, now." Emily hesitated, looking back in the direction of the road, but the pull of the forest was undeniable. "What if someone needs help?" she asked, her voice laced with a fear she was trying to suppress. My instincts screamed to turn back, but before I could respond, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot interrupted us. We froze. Something or someone was out there hidden in the shadows. I scanned the darkness, but the fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. The silence was broken again by the scream closer, louder, and more horrifying than before. It echoed through the trees, reverberating in my bones. "Run!" I yelled, pulling Emily back toward the road. We stumbled through the woods, branches clawing at our clothes and skin. But the faster we ran, the closer the screams seemed to get. It was as if the forest itself was alive, shifting and changing to trap us within its grasp. The darkness felt suffocating, the air thick with dread. Emily tripped over a root, falling hard onto the ground. I helped her up, my own legs shaking as we struggled to keep moving. The screams were all around us now, closing in from every direction. Panic surged through me, and I realized with terrifying clarity that we were lost. The road was nowhere in sight. The trees all looked the same, and the fog was so dense we could barely see our hands in front of us. "We have to keep moving," I urged Emily, though I didn't know where to go. Every direction felt wrong, but staying still felt worse. Emily's breaths were ragged, fear etched on her face as she looked around wildly. "What is happening?" she cried, her voice breaking. I didn't have an answer, but the screams, they were coming for us. They weren't just sounds in the distance anymore. They felt alive, hunting us through the darkness. Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing, and for a moment, there was silence again. The fog lifted just enough to reveal something horrifying. In the center of the clearing, carved into the ground, were strange, twisted symbols, almost like runes etched deep into the earth. They pulsed with an unsettling energy, as though they were alive. Emily backed away, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? What is this?" she stammered. I didn't know, but the air around us felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep us from leaving, as though we had trespassed somewhere we didn't belong. Then the screams returned, louder and more agonizing than before. But this time, they weren't just echoing through the trees. They were coming from the ground beneath us. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the earth seemed to tremble beneath my feet. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing with the rhythm of the screams. Emily grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening wails. I nodded, pulling her with me as we fled from the clearing. But no matter how far we ran, the screams followed, growing louder and more desperate with each step. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs gave out beneath us. The screams didn't stop. They never stopped. And then, without warning, everything went silent again. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse than the screams themselves. We stood there, gasping for breath, too afraid to move. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know. My mind was racing, but there was no logic, no explanation for what was happening. The forest felt like a maze, trapping us in its grip. The road was gone. The town was miles away, and we were utterly alone. The fog swirled around us as if it had a mind of its own, and for the first time, I felt truly helpless. We were lost in this dark, twisted place, surrounded by something we couldn't understand. The fear gnawed at me, an overwhelming sense of dread settling deep in my bones. Suddenly, a low, guttural moan erupted from the shadows. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound echoed through the clearing. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, raw and primal, resonating with a deep sense of despair. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but the darkness enveloped everything. Emily clutched my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. I could feel the urgency in her words, but I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a force I couldn't understand. That's when I noticed movement in the fog, shadows flitting just beyond my line of sight. "Did you see that?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. But before Emily could respond, the shadows coalesced, forming figures that appeared to be drifting toward us. They were vague, ghostly shapes, barely there yet undeniably present. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The forest was alive with more than just sounds. The figures began to take shape, revealing hollow eyes and twisted expressions. They were trapped souls, I realized with a shudder lost in this realm, bound to the screams that filled the air each night. I felt sick as the realization washed over me. These were the remnants of those who had come before us, drawn into the forest by the same chilling cries. "We have to go," I urged, turning to pull Emily away. But she was rooted in place, staring at the figures as if hypnotized. "Look at them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're suffering." I wanted to shake her, to make her understand that staring wouldn't help us. We were in danger, and we needed to escape. As if in response to her gaze, the figures began to wail, a collective cry that echoed through the clearing and sent a shiver down my spine. The screams intertwined with the wind, filling the air with a dreadful cacophony. The ground beneath us shook, and I felt a surge of panic. We couldn't stay here. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. I yanked Emily away, dragging her back through the trees, ignoring the way the fog curled around us like a living thing. The figures receded behind us, but their cries followed, haunting and relentless. It felt like we were running through a nightmare, but I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. We stumbled into a thicket of branches and brambles, tearing at our clothes and skin. The screams were a constant reminder of our peril, and I could feel their despair settling into my bones. My heart raced as I fought through the underbrush, desperate to find our way back to the road. Finally, just as I thought my legs would give out, I saw a faint glow in the distance. My heart soared with hope, and I shouted to Emily, "Over there! I see something!" We stumbled toward the light, the sound of our pursuers fading behind us. But as we drew closer, my heart sank. It was a campfire, surrounded by more figures living, breathing people. They sat huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, eyes filled with a vacant terror. They stared into the flames, seemingly oblivious to our presence. "Help us!" I shouted, but the words felt hollow. They didn't react, lost in their own world of fear. "What's wrong with them?" Emily gasped, stepping closer to the fire. I wanted to turn back, to flee, but something compelled me to stay. "Maybe they can help us," I said, though my voice trembled. The fire crackled ominously, casting strange shadows that danced along the edges of the clearing. I approached cautiously, calling out to the people. "Hey, we need help!" But they remained silent, eyes locked on the flames as if entranced. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. A chill ran down my spine as I turned to Emily. Fear etched on her face. "I don't think they can help us," she whispered. And then I heard it again, the screams. They were back, more insistent than ever, echoing through the clearing. The figures around the fire stirred, faces contorting in anguish, as if they were trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. I realized with a jolt that we had stumbled into another trap, another layer of this nightmare. "We have to go," I yelled, but before we could turn back, the flames flickered violently, and the ground trembled beneath us. The campfire erupted in a burst of light, revealing the faces of the lost souls. Their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped, reliving their final moments around this fire. We turned to run, but the forest had other plans. The trees shifted, closing in around us as if to keep us from escaping. Panic surged within me, and I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her through the thicket. The screams growing louder, a desperate chorus urging us to flee. As we sprinted, the forest twisted and turned, the path morphing before our eyes. We were caught in a nightmare, unable to find our way out. Every scream felt like a thread pulling us deeper into darkness, and I could feel the weight of despair hanging heavy in the air. Just when I thought all hope was lost, we stumbled upon a narrow path, barely visible through the fog. Without thinking, I took Emily's hand and darted down it, praying it would lead us to safety. The screams became a haunting echo behind us, but I didn't dare look back. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the woods, but it felt different now, more alive, more forgiving. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the distance, a trickle of hope amidst the terror. "Keep going," I urged, pushing us onward, the path seeming to guide us. Finally, we broke through the trees and into a small clearing, with a shimmering river cutting through the landscape. The moon hung high above us, casting a silver glow over everything. I felt the weight of the forest lifting, the screams fading into the night. But just as I thought we were safe, I noticed something horrifying in the water. Reflected in the surface were the twisted, anguished faces of the souls we had encountered. They reached out toward us, their mouths moving in silent screams. It hit me then, a chilling realization. We had not escaped. We were now part of their haunting cycle, bound to the darkness. Emily's grip on my hand tightened, but there was nothing left to do. As we stood there, I understood. We would scream silently in the dark, forever lost in the shadows of the forest.